thank you, to develop training around the applications of conservation practices. And this training would be geared towards three different audiences, or the training, so plural, are geared towards conservation professionals, farm business management educators, and ag lenders. And so the whole purpose of this project, which I'll get into more in detail later, is really to sort of help close some gaps, knowledge gaps around sort of the financial implications of conservation practices among these audiences, knowing that that's an area that's ripe for new knowledge, and a lot of people we know that producers are really curious about those financial implications. It's a big question, and that they're all considering, but we need to ensure that those who are working with them are well equipped with the knowledge they need to sort of help them make decisions that are financially sound. And so we're today going to talk to you about a training that we developed for this. And I want to say that this project was funded by North Central SARE, so we want to thank them for their support of our work. And so the who of this project is who you see here on this slide. This was a collaborative effort between UW-Madison Division of Extension, which I represent, as well as the North Central Region Water Network. And I just realized I didn't really introduce myself or give Marcelle and Anna an opportunity to introduce themselves, but I'll maybe do that in a second after I sort of go through these logos. But then also, obviously, University of Minnesota is part of this partnership, as well as Environmental Defense Fund, Compeer Financial, and Croatan Institute. And so we are all sort of combining forces to sort of, we bring very different skills and knowledge to this project, and we were able to sort of, really blend it all to make our to create our deliverables. And so maybe I'll just pause here and introduce and give the team an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm Jenny Seifert. I'm with the University of Wisconsin Madison Division of Extension. I work under the North Central Region Water Network. I'm a watershed outreach specialist, so my work is actually multi-state. I don't focus on just Wisconsin. I'm focused really across the Great Lakes and Mississippi River basins for the most part, supporting conservation professionals and farmers in their work to improve soil and water resources. Marcelle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Marcelle Lewandowski, University of Minnesota Water Resources Center. My focus is on agricultural watershed quality and management, and I am the coordinator for the Minnesota Office for Soil Health.
I'm Anna Cates, also from University of Minnesota. I'm an extension specialist and with the Office for Soil Health as well.
Awesome. And so we are just three of I think we're now 5 strong team. So yeah. So if you want to go to the next slide, Marcelle. The overall, again, I kind of alluded to this already, but the overall goal of this project is really to sort of close gaps in sort of the financial knowledge and information related to the financial implications of conservation practices among 3 different audiences. Again, those are conservation professionals or educators. Many of you probably fall into this category, farm business management educators, as well as agricultural lenders. And the way that we are trying to close these sort of knowledge gaps is through training and resource development that can sort of enhance their capacity to help farmers achieve profitable and sustainable operations. So it's a little bit of a train the trainer approach. Another sort of implicit goal of this is these 3 audiences, they all are really key advisors to farmers, but they don't often interact with each other. And so another sort of sub-goal of the project was to create opportunities for them to sort of cross-pollinate, to meet each other, to network, and sort of build those connections so they can sort of all work better together to be supporting farmers. And so you want to go to the next slide, Marcelle? Just to let you know, so we've done, as part of this project, we've done a bunch of trainings to date. This project was a 2-year-long project. Will be ending the end of January, so we're nearing our finish line. But we know, as you'll see, I won't read all of it, but as you'll see, we've done several trainings for our 3 audiences. The ones I want to highlight are the ones in bold. So the ones that we're going to really be talking about today, that's what you need to know about to help farmers do conservation profitably, and that was geared towards conservation educators. And then economics of agricultural conservation practices and how to talk to farmers about it, and that was for farm business management educators. And so what we're going to be talking about today is those trainings specifically, because we develop these trainings to be replicable. So basically, we've developed a curriculum and a framework and a bunch of materials, and we're hoping that we're packaging it together as something that folks can use to engage educators in their areas. And so really to make it something that people can do elsewhere, and so that we can reach more people. So our focus area for the project was Wisconsin and Minnesota, and these were really pilot trainings. And so we're sort of taking what we learned from those pilot trainings and sort of sending it out in the world, and sort of allowing others to use what we've learned to sort of help deliver this knowledge to other people. And the other sort of one event I want to just highlight on this sort of chart is the one at the bottom, where we connected all three audiences. Last month, we did a peer learning oriented workshop that really brought all three of our audiences together. It was called Connecting Farm Finance and Conservation. And it was a very successful workshop. And one thing we learned from it is that there is indeed really a thirst for building these connections between ag lenders and conservation educators and farm business management educators. And the folks that were attending that event really talked about how they would like to see more of stuff like this. And so we want to sort of just plant that seed with you all as encouragement to think about how you might help build those connections in your own areas. But from here out, we're going to focus on these trainings that we've done and sort of the curriculum that we've developed, and how you might use it in your own programming. Because sort of our pitch to you all today is we've developed this training. Seems to be a need for it, and we hope that you can find a way to use it in your programming. And so that's where we're going to take the conversation next. And I think I'm going to hand the baton to Anna.
Hi, everybody. I really have a pretty short element here today, but I wanted to, I guess, share my experience as a conservation professional, going through some of these trainings, developing the curriculum, and then, getting more familiar with it by attending the trainings. This is a picture of the peer learning event, which is the main in-person event we've done that gathered all the audiences together. The main thing that we want to highlight is that this is programming that you could add either to an existing event or to highlight in a one-off event. So some of these financial concepts, a lot of conservation professionals professed a lot of interest in trying to develop skills along those lines. For the financial professionals, on the other hand, they don't always know their local conservation people. And so bringing them some information about that at an existing financial, meeting makes a lot of sense. Or bringing somebody to talk about farm finances makes a lot of sense to come to a conservation event. These were just very rich conversations. People really liked to hear what the other side was doing. And I think it helped for me, dispel some of the myths that are out there that the lenders can be a block in implementing conservation on the landscape. I'm sure that happens occasionally, but I had a much greater sense that the lenders are not trying to be a block on conservation based on talking to so many people and learning more about their processes. I'll stop there and let Marcelle tell you more about what exactly people learned at these events.
Okay, so I'm going to go through the curriculum that we developed and used, and there's going to be, I'm going to warn you, a lot of text on all these slides. My apologies, but all of this information is going into a facilitator's guide that we're preparing. And Jenny, when were we going to have that ready? January? Is that soon? We'll have this all available, so don't feel like you have to capture all of this. There's obviously a lot of different ways to use this material, but I wanted to start with keeping your eye on the ball of why are we doing this? And basically it's because we are hoping that conservation professionals will address the financial concerns of the conservation practices for farmers, and that farm business management educators will provide information about conservation programs and their impact on the farm business. In both these cases, these audiences are not comfortable crossing over outside their expertise, and so they tend to leave this out, even though they both know it's important. The conservationists, they'll say again and again, it comes down to economics. It's got to make economic sense, and on and on. And yet they won't talk about it because they're just not comfortable with it. So we asked the question of, so some of the learning objectives we're trying to get at to help build that comfort is just summarizing the data. What do we know about the profitability of, specifically, we were focused on cover crops, reduced tillage, no-till, and grazing. So those were kind of the three things we were focusing on, and specifically, how did those affect farm profitability? Second and third, want to make sure that people understand the common farm finance principles and the common conservation programs. Number four, we want to be able to point people to advisors who can provide the more advanced information on all these topics. And number five, we want people to have the information, or we want to help farmers have the information that they need to go to their lenders. So what do they need to do that? Number six, know how to use some of these farm budget tools. And then number seven, start to identify how can you incorporate these topics into your existing programming, whatever that might be. And in all of these cases, networking is really at the core of it and a pretty critical piece of it. We need to do a better job of the farm business management educators meeting the conservationists and vice versa, and bringing each other into each other's events. These are the modules that we developed, and I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. The introductions are important, like I said, for this networking thing. Make sure people are introducing each other, and we also use the introduction time to dismiss carbon markets and explain that we're not talking about carbon markets. We sort of view that as a separate thing because it's not as predictable. It's, you know, our focus is really on a farming operation and how do those practices that you would use in a farm operation and how it impacts that. Okay, after the introductions, we have the Farm Finance 101 module. This is reviewing what are the annual financial activities that a farmer goes through. And this is targeted at the conservationists. Obviously, the farm business managers don't need this, but just explaining these fundamentals. And then part two here is about ag lenders. How do they work with farmers? What's that relationship like? And then three, how do number one and two fit into, how does conservation fit into all of that? When looking at number three, there's some discussion there of risks. And I think being very aware that when people say, I'm concerned about risk, there's two different things they're talking about, and you have to make sure you're talking about the same thing. The big piece that's commonly in the forefront of farmers' mind is, how do I avoid the risk of getting this practice to work? How do I avoid the financial risk of trying no-till or whatever it might be? Conservationists, on the other hand, tend to emphasize that practices, these practices we're talking about, theoretically can help reduce overall financial risk if it's improving resilience and such. So that's a real different way of talking about risk, and you have to make sure people are on the same page. So for the farm business management educators, we give them a Conservation 101 module. A lot of these folks are not as familiar with the conservation practices themselves, so you need a basic introduction, and you need to differentiate between the in-field practices and the edge of field engineered installations and easements and that sort of thing, because those two things impact the financial planning very differently. They have different initial installation starting and impact financial costs, and then ongoing costs are different for these two. So how do you fit those into a budget is a different conversation. And then item 2 here, that what financial assistance is available for conservation? What do farmers need to know to navigate these programs? And what are the components of the programs that farmers should be looking for? This is stuff that conservationists live and breathe, but the farm business folks don't necessarily aren't as familiar with it. So helping get them up to speed. And then third, in this module, we really like to emphasize the importance of technical support and peer mentoring for the success of practices. So we avoid talking about, or we try to shift people away from saying, do cover crops pay off or not? It's not a yes or a no. It's if you, it works if you have the right technical support. It depends on how you implement it as to how it's going to work financially. So if it's going to be financially successful, you have to have that technical support in place. All right, the next module, landowner tenant considerations. I think this is fairly straightforward. What are the options for setting up a lease agreement as far as who carries the different burdens or risks, or who's responsible for different pieces of it? What are some model leases that you can look at? What happens when a landowner is initiating it versus when a tenant is initiating an interest in conservation practices? And then a focus on, or acknowledgement that in a lot of cases we're dealing with women landowners, non-operating landowners, and sometimes that's a different audience that you reach differently than some of your other farm audiences. And the next module is the data. What is the data we're talking here? And before I get into that, I want to clarify again, when you say economics of conservation, people have different things in mind, and you better make sure that when they say, I need to understand the economics, that you're both talking about the same thing. And the three major categories is there's case studies, or the individual farmer that you're talking to. And this is really important because every single operation is in a different situation, and averages don't really tell you how it's going to work for you as an individual farmer. So the second thing, or the second thing people mean when they say, what's the economics of no-till practices or whatever it might be? And this is aggregated data. So we're still talking at the farm scale. This is still farm scale economics, but now we're aggregating across and getting averages and ranges across many farms. And this is important to see what's the potential impact for an individual. And it also can be useful as a macroeconomic impact, or getting at the macroeconomic impact across the whole ag sector. And then the third thing is, people will say, what's the economics of it? They're talking about societal benefits. They're talking about ecosystem services. They're talking about the overall ag economy. And this information is important for estimating the return on investment from government programs. So all three of these are important sources of information, but make sure it fits what people are looking for and how they want to use the information. So the data, this farm economics of conservation practices, the aggregated data, the first piece of it is, where do you find this data? And Jenny, I meant to put this into the chat, but I wonder if you could put that link to the financial implications booklet in there would be great. This is EDF, our partner on this project, has pulled together a whole lot of this data, and is especially focusing on some of the FinBin data out of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And that's where a lot of this information comes from. So where do you get this data? What is the impact of financial impact across all of these farms on the tillage, the cover crops, the grazing? And then how do you understand the quality of data, the limitations of it, and how to interpret and use it effectively? Those are important components. We talk a little about farm budgeting tools. This is something that we thought this would be a very useful thing. You've probably all seen these spreadsheets people have put together for either using cover crops or grazing or whatever it might be. and they have a nice Excel spreadsheet with all the different costs and benefits, so farmers can put in their information and do a calculation. Is this going to pay off for me? And these tend to be pretty appealing to the academics and researchers, but the people, the instructors we were working with were a little lukewarm to them. And so we decided not to put a lot of time into training people on using an individual tool. Instead, the advice from Serge Koenig, who is a partner we are working with from Wisconsin in a county office, he said, pick one of the tools that's relevant in your area and what you're working on, or develop your own rough template, learn to use it, and then work with the farmers to complete it. Don't expect farmers to use it on their own. So that's basically how we handled that. We just sort of pointed people to a few that are available and suggested they figure that out on their own. And then the final module was working with farmers. And this one, all of these modules really depend on the instructor, and whoever is working with you as you're presenting this material is going to shape a lot of these modules. And we will be providing the PowerPoint slides that we used, and like I say, this facilitator's guide, which has a lot of suggestions for activities and content and links that you'll want to share with people. So we provide all of that, but we expect that you will modify this to suit your purposes. But this module in particular depends on the instructor and what their perspective and style of working is. But some of the content we talked about in this module was just the basic principles: build trust, practice good listening, help farmers identify their goals, that kind of thing. We talked about the conservationist role and the farm business management educator's role in talking about finance and conservation. So being clear about what's your lane, where's the limits of your expertise, and what can you do even though this isn't your expertise. There's still a lot you can do and should be doing. How do you use the data that was presented? How do you prepare farmers to talk to their lender? And this is an example, like a conservationist, even if you don't know the finance, you can still help farmers articulate their goals and help them gather the data they need. And that's what they need to take to their lenders. They need to tell their lenders, okay, here's why I'm doing this conservation practice. This is what my goal. And that's a great role for the conservationists to help with. Make sure that folks understand the ag lender point of view and consider different messaging that's needed for different audiences, whether it's early and middle adopters, landowners, landlords versus renters, and so on. Okay, that was a whirlwind. And at this point, and we can take questions later, but right now, Jenny is going to take over again and talk about some of the evaluation results, to just share some of the tips and what we learned from interacting with people.
Yeah, thanks, Marcelle. So as I mentioned, this was, we developed these trainings as a sort of the pilot version. So we tested them out to see how well they worked, and then we're revising them and making them publicly available to folks like yourselves based on sort of what we learned from the process. And one thing that we, I think, forgot to mention at the beginning is that so not only did we evaluate the training after it was done, we also, in order to develop the training, we did some audience research. So with our target audiences of conservation educators and farm business management educators, as well as ag lenders for our ag lender trainings. But the purpose of that audience research was really to try to understand what their training needs were and what they wanted to know. And so what we learned from that audience research, and that research looked like interviews and focus groups, essentially with groups of these individuals. But so we took what we learned from those from that research to develop these trainings, and so it's very much informed by what we heard from that research. And so at the other end of the training, we did an evaluation to sort of see, did the training sort of meet our learning objectives, and did the participants find value in it? And so we're going to show you some of those results. So I'm first showing you some results from our conservation educator training. And this is so that we had, I can't remember how many, I apologize, I should know this number, but I don't remember how many people registered for the training and attended, but we got 48 people responding to our evaluation. So that's a pretty good number to sort of learn from. And if you want to go to the next slide, Marcelle. And so some of the, I'm not going to go through every single question that we asked them, but we sort of picked out some of the more important ones. You know, one of the big learning objectives was, whether this training increases their knowledge around how conservation practices impact farm profitability. And as you can see, everybody had at least a little bit of increased knowledge as a result of this training. Most people a moderate amount, and some people learned quite a bit from the training about farm profitability and conservation. Next slide, Marcelle. It doesn't look like it did. Oh, great, it did. Sorry, it looks so similar. The next one, so another sort of big thing we were really interested in. You know, one thing we heard from, especially from the audience research, is that there's maybe a lack of confidence in talking about these topics with farmers just because it's not their expertise, which is totally understandable. So hopefully a training like this does increase their confidence in discussing these topics. And so that was sort of one of the things we asked about, is has it increased your confidence in discussing finance topics with farmers? And again, most people said at least a moderate amount, and some people did say a lot. And the next slide. And then we also wanted to know how likely they are to try to incorporate some of what they learned into their programming. And as you can see, most people are either or at least somewhat likely to incorporate what something that they learned into their programming with farmers. Next slide. And just to show you some of the things that we learned from them, you know, we had some open-ended responses in the evaluation surveys. Some of the positive things that we heard was that this training is a really great way to set up new educators for success. So I'm not going to read the quotes that you see there. I'll let you read them on your own. But what that first quote is getting at is that this was a newer educator, and she found it to be helpful for sort of getting up to speed with what they would need to know for doing their work with farmers. Another piece of positive feedback that we got was that it did provide a pretty good broad understanding of farm finance basics. And really those basics are sort of just really key for what conservation educators might need to know. And then others sort of expressed that there is indeed a need for this subject matter, and they appreciated that this training was meeting that, or was addressing that need. And then next slide. And then, you know, in terms of room for improvement, and that we, you know, are hoping to incorporate into the facilitator's guide and to help others learn from and use, and when if they decide to sort of deliver this training where they are. One suggestion was to spend some time on real life scenarios. So talking about real life cost benefit scenarios. So that's something that we learned. Another thing is to ensure that there's plenty of time for questions. You know, as happens with these things, you know, we sort of run out of time for those questions. And so I think making sure that there is more time for questions, I think people really appreciate that. Another room for improvement is including, so being sure to include some concrete examples that strengthen the connection between farm finance and conservation, as well as include some breakout sessions to let participants digest the information that they received. So those are some things to be considering if you do decide to deliver this training somewhere where you are. And then in terms of evaluation results from the farm business management educator side of things, that training was a little bit smaller in numbers. And so we had fewer respondents to our survey as a result, and we had 14 respondents. And then I'll just show you sort of some very similar questions as what we asked conservation educators, but slightly framed differently. So the first question was, you know, how much did this training increase your knowledge about how conservation practices impact farm profitability? Same question that we asked the conservation educators. And as you can see, again, every participant, or at least respondent, learned at least a little bit, mostly a moderate amount that can of knowledge, new knowledge. The next slide. And then how much had this training increased your confidence in discussing conservation finance with farmers? Again, at least a little bit of confidence increase, and most among everybody. And then how likely are you to incorporate conservation topics into your programming as a result? I think this group was a little bit more, seemed a little bit more likely to incorporate something that they learned into their programming than the conservation educator group, as you can see in these results. They are a little bit more terse with their positive feedback. As you can see here, nothing terribly useful other than sort of some nice sort of gratitude for the workshop. But in terms of where we could improve, there was some good feedback that was super useful to be considering. Again, sort of this idea of providing examples and getting specific with some of the economic calculations and some of the farm budgets et cetera. So just, I think the importance of being specific and providing examples, which can be hard sometimes. We recognize that, given that, you know, the data isn't always out there for everything, but as best as possible, being specific is helpful for folks. Again, the suggestion of including discussions or great breakout groups. And then finally, somebody did suggest that you know, you don't have to do 2 separate trainings for conservation educators and farm business management educators, and that potentially you could blend a training. You could do a blended training with both groups with these modules. So that's sort of what we learned from the evaluation that we hope is helpful. So in addition to what we just talked about with the, again, the facilitator's guide will be hopefully be coming out, will be coming out sometime in January. And again, that is something that we hope that educators like yourselves or those that you work with can see value in using in your own programming. But we also have created a few other resources on this project. One, I'm going to put the links to them in the chat. One we've already shared, which is the second one, which is a booklet called The Financial Implications of Conservation Agriculture, Insights from Analyses of Farms in the Upper Midwest. This is basically a synthesis of existing research around the financial implications of conservation agriculture, specifically cover crops, reduced tillage, managed grazing, and we do good into nutrient management in this one. And so those materials are there for you all to use in your sort of in your outreach to farmers as well as to other educators. And then I'm just putting those links in the chat right now. Sorry, they kind of combined, but the first one is the Conservation Economics and Finance Resource Hub, and this is basically a compilation of existing case studies, reports, et cetera, that are all research based around the sort of this topic of conservation economics and finance, and sort of what is known to date is hopefully in this resource hub, and it's really geographically focused on the North Central region. So hopefully if it's geographically applicable to everybody here, but I definitely encourage you to check that out and see if there are materials that are useful to you. Another forthcoming resource is we did a survey of ag lenders in terms of their knowledge and perceptions about conservation agriculture. You know, there's very little known to date about how ag lenders see conservation agriculture. So this is sort of our attempt to help close that knowledge gap, to sort of know, you know, where are lenders coming from with this stuff, and then sort of what does that mean in terms of how we might engage with them and train them to be able to support farmers' decisions regarding conservation.
I am gonna thank you. First of all, thank you, Marcelle, Jenny, and Anna for talking to us today and for really leading the charge on this. When we talk about soil health, we always get questions about economics. It's always suggested that we delve a little bit deeper into the economics of soil health, and this really was leading the charge on that. We do have a grant that Soil Health Nexus just received. We'll start January 1 from SARE, the North Central Region SARE, and we will be looking into soil health costs like a little bit more. I'm actually looking at the next step to our soil health matrix and putting some dollars and cents, real dollars and cents behind that. That's exciting, and you're just getting us ready. You're getting us into that, world. So. All right. So this is a question from Jenny. Do you have any idea of why the conservation educators were hesitant or somewhat likely about incorporating finances into their conservation with farmers?
Is that regarding our evaluation results or just sort of in general? Yeah, we didn't ask sort of for more detail on that question, so we don't know why. I don't know, Marcelle or Anna, if you have any speculations.
I'm just speculating they didn't reach a point of comfort that, you know, there's still isn't something they're used to.
Yeah, I think you'd have to spend some hours, you know, really messing around with the spreadsheets to remind yourself, okay, this is revenue and this is profit and this is the sort of time scale at which the cash flow occurs. Like you'd really have to mess around perhaps on your own for a little while. It's just not going to happen listening to somebody talk through it. So it was exposure, but that's certainly another step you could take if you wanted to really give people skills that you'd have to dig deeper.
I think incorporating some time at the end of any kind of event like this to talk about how can you incorporate this into your programming would be great to help people start to think about where does it fit? Who can I bring to my field day? And well, what are some phrases that I can say to farmers when I visit them on their farm? Just this real implementation level conversations.
And I see a question from Candy. How do you get this content? Are you referring to the training content that we talked about? Yeah, so that is what what we will be making available in January. Is we're going to be we're in the process of wrapping up creating that facilitator's guide and sort of that package of materials which we'll make available.
The webinars are in the process of getting closed captioned, apparently. So then they'll be widely available to our pilot trainings.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody out there, and you can put this in the chat, anybody have some intentions to do some training on this, or do you have some ideas about how you might use this? Or who would you like to partner with?
I can speak. Oh, go ahead, Landon.
Sorry. I am currently sort of building on this, going to be attending a multi-module course through food and finance next year, I believe, to delve into these subjects a little bit more. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the folks there with food and finance. So I guess it's one other thing that I'm going to be building off of in my venture to become more aware of this realm.
Rachel, I see you mentioned I assume you mean you would like to partner with the University Extension economist. What position are you in?
I work for the NRCS as a soil scientist.
Great.
And so, well, I guess the USDA has some economists, but I feel like they're not as they're not as focused on a local area as a university extension faculty are. Like the USDA economists seem to like cover really larger trends. And so I think, especially as a soil scientist, I don't really have as much background in economics. And so I think you could try to self-teach yourself some economics, but all the trends in the marketplace change every year. And it would be good to have someone that was really in tune with that, and that was their area of specialty.
Yeah, one thing we've talked about is just, when you're doing an event, having someone like that there also to present. Yeah, so doing some of your typical conservation soils programming and also having some economics programming. And then one follow-up a lot of people mentioned was just, we're going to reach out to the local lenders and invite them to our conservation events. That was an easy next step a lot of people identified.
Yeah, and we kind of hope with the sort of the modular nature, if you will, of the training that, if you are doing an event and you want to just pick one of the modules and try to incorporate it into that event, that is, that framework is there for you to sort of develop that.
Can you guys talk a little bit more about different ways of adapting this for working with lenders. Yes, you're talking about doing group activities, group like traditional, more like maybe a one-on-one is better with lenders. Is there a schedule, like a season where it's better to work with them? I guess you can talk general experience.
Yeah, I can start, and then I'd love to hear about what Marcelle and Anna have to say as well. I think some of the things that we learned is sort of meeting lenders where they are is really important. And so there are a number of like lender conferences and events out there where you can, if you can get on their agenda and do trainings there, that is maybe one of the best ways of reaching lenders. So for example, all of the lender trainings that we did, that's what we did. We got on the agenda of an existing event. And we didn't talk about any of the lender trainings that we did today. That was slightly different in nature, than these. But that said, I do think that lenders could gain a lot from these trainings as well. So inviting lenders to participate in these trainings would be valuable. What was the other thing I was going to say? I can't remember. Maybe Marcelle and Anna, if you have other things to say, I can try to remember what else I was going to say.
I don't know about working one-on-one versus working in a group with lenders. If you're looking to increase your own understanding, maybe one-on-one would be better, that helps with the social element of feeling silly in front of a group, right? But I think that, part of the lender makeup is that they want to talk to farmers. They're looking for customers, right? They're interacting with the farm community. So I think they don't mind coming to events just to be social to some extent. That was my impression. I don't know about times of year though. I can't recall anything about their sort of workflow seasonally.
Yeah, I don't remember either. I'm seeing Candy's question is the target audience producers, lenders, and conservation extension, or just one group? And yes, we didn't develop this for producers. We developed it for the advisors who work with producers. And we did present it separately for the conservationists, the local conservation district, that kind of staff was one audience. The other was for the farm business managers, and then the ag lenders are a third audience. So we sort of treated all three of those separately. But then this event in October where we brought all of them into one room, I would say myself, really surprised me how effective that was. And I would suggest you think about that. If you can find even a small group of people that represent those different audiences to start thinking about how can we do more of this in our state. They were just really interested and surprised by, what they could learn from these other audiences. So there's a lot of good energy from bringing them all into one group.
Yeah, and your follow-up question, definitely nothing wrong with bringing in a producer. I do think, one thing we did learn in our audience research was that there was interest in producers being part of the training delivery and being part of sort of that facilitation team. And I think also at that peer learning event that we had, folks talked about also including producers. So I think there's definitely room to be including producers in the delivery of the material.
I will say that producers weren't. Go ahead, Marcelle.
Well, it emphasizes that when I said there were three different kinds of what's the economics of this. And so when you have a producer, you're talking about the case study. They're usually talking about, here's what happened on my farm. So just being aware of the limitations of that and make sure the audience understands what that data is good for.
I will say, just regarding Stan and Candy's comments now, that I don't think our primary audience was producers. We're assuming that producers kind of understand their own finances, or educating producers about their finances isn't really the primary goal of this, but making sure that talking about finances is not a barrier for implementing conservation for those people who are doing conservation education. I'm probably a little biased coming at it from that side a lot, but I think that a lot of people in this room are probably also conservation educators, so excuse that.
One other group to cross-pollinate discussion, I do think having lenders and conservationists in the same room as farm managers is a great idea. Also, insurance adjusters, insurance agents. I've learned a lot from folks. Typically, they tend to also be farmers themselves anyway, but they're just very like economically focused and they understand the system very well. And that has been an obstacle in the past with conservation practices like cover crops. And it's becoming way more lax in recent years in conversations with folks. Even planting dates and stuff is becoming more lax, but maybe a great group of folks to keep in the loop.
I'm glad you brought that up, Landon. You're absolutely right. And that's not an audience we address just because of limiting the scope of what we were working on. But I think you're wise to bring them into the conversation too.
I guess if there is no other questions, we can end a little bit early. And I want to thank you again for coming today. Expect some information as it comes along, as it gets completed, and we will put it in the new drawer in the Soil Health Nexus toolbox. We have a new drawer for finances and economics. So we can start filling that drawer with some of this information. Again, we have no digital cafe in December, but we will come back in January, on January 17th, and keep track of your email, and you'll see an update with the speakers and the presentations as we go along. And hopefully we will have next year's all up and going so you can see and prepare for our digital cafes for next year. As always, if you have any great speaker or topic you want us to address, please let us know, and we'll be happy to get that set up for you. So thank you for coming.